So here we are at drawing number 2, ideas number 2, the second step in a journey of many thousands of steps. And in this drawing, actually where there are 2 drawings, what you're looking at is one of my early attempts to answer a question that I had had for a long, long time. Somewhat in my studies about philosophers and mostly about the nature of the mind and human nature and things like that, I was amazed by the idea that prior to around 1800, a little later, a little earlier, kind of messy, that there was no sense in the world that we had an unconscious. Now, there is a notable personality theorist, John Kielstrom, who says there is no such thing. And when you read what he's saying, you can't discount everything he's saying, but I actually think it's much more the way that we say it that determines whether we believe it exists or not. But setting that aside, for me, and perhaps you've begun to get an inkling of this from the first video and the cover of the first Emergent School manual, perhaps you've begun to understand that I learn by drawing, and drawing in an unusual way. I make drawings that make my conception of things, my idea of things, my spiritual sense of things. The drawings they give it a physical existence on the page. They give it color, they give it shape, they give it place, and so on. So the 2 drawings that you're looking at are my attempt to understand one of those philosophers at the early 1800s. His name is Herbart. He's a largely forgotten but very important person in the area of learning and education. He taught as the head of the, I don't know what it would have been called then, but the philosophy department at Königsberg in what was then Prussia, and he was a successor to Immanuel Kant. All of these things are really unnecessary to know. And really the point of what I'm trying to say is that my mind gets stimulated by many, many, many people who came before me. And here is this man, Herbart, Professor Herbart, and I read some of the things that he was doing in an attempt to understand the mind. And his way of looking at the mind was very different than Kant and the philosophers in general. He was looking at it as, I want to know who I am. I want to know who you are. I want to understand how we are different. And so in an effort to do this, he begins to write about something, which is that we have this repository inside us of a lot of material. And we have thoughts that come into our minds. And he then talked a lot about how does that happen? What decides the next thought? What determines that we will feel a feeling next? Where does that happen? He is a person who is beginning to say that we have an unconscious. But it's not his way yet. It's not in the world yet that way. And what he uses, and I have yet to understand the proper pronunciation of this word, but it's spelled L-I-M-E-N, limen, and it roughly translates to the line between what we can't see, but it's in our unconscious, and what we are now experiencing. It exists today in the word subliminal. Limen is in that word, That's the line that Herbart talked about when, the early 1800s. But for me, I grew up and was educated in a world where there are three parts, and if it's Freud's version, it's the unconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious. And if it's Jung's version, it's the unconscious, subconscious, and conscious. But they are taking this idea of the mind and they are dividing it into two parts. But, and this is important, only one of the parts is conscious. The other two parts are, we completely don't see it, like looking at the bottom of a lake and having some sense that's where the fish are. Oh, let's throw our lines in now, but not seeing anything. And seeing some kind of movement on the surface of the water, but not seeing the fish. Subconscious. So there is a two that are one. Unconscious and subconscious are two parts, and together somehow those two things cause the conscious to emerge. All right, I had none of this language when I was making these drawings, and it's a set of about 8 of them, and I only had room for 2, barely. But somehow they kind of remind me of the movie The Matrix, and the way the machines moved around, and so many other things. But if you look at the drawings, you can see the two that are one in the left side of the drawings. There's the unconscious, there's the subconscious, and there's the conscious. And you can see how the raw materials, whatever, are in that lower part, and then they move up, and as you see them move up, you see them make connections. This is very important. Everything in emergence centers around the idea of a science that defines the purpose of the science as discovering the way natural things connect. Why? Because it is in those connections that we assign meanings to the things in our world. It's not the things themselves, even if we talk about it that way. It is, the meanings are in the connections. Think about the difference between doing something like standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon or the edge of the cliffs at Santorini, one mostly called Thera, but English people now call it Santorini. Anyway, the cliffs in both places, I have been to both, I've stood there with both, and in both cases, I was amazed. However, when I think back on those two experiences, and this is the two that are one, the cliffs are very beautiful. The colors are different, but the layers are very similar. The height of the cliffs is very similar. But when I went to the Grand Canyon, I went with a group of people, none of whom did I know. I did not have personal experiences there. I had personal experiences with nature, which in the emergence world is called layer 10, but I did not have experiences with people. When I looked, I was drawn into the face of the baby of nature, the beauty of those rocks. Now, when I went to Santorini, which is many years later, I went with my friends Linda and Lenny. And while Linda was quite a bitch at times, I still loved her, and I loved Lenny, and we had such a wonderful time. And when we stood on those cliffs and looked at them together, the meaning of those cliffs is not just about nature or, the rocks, the colors, the whatever. The meaning that emerged is something much more. Something that I can't put words to. Now, you may have noticed that I welled up a moment ago, and I welled up because both Linda and Lenny died within a few years of that trip. Both of them from cancer and of the pancreas, very painful, and within 2 years of each other. when something emerges, it stays alive and beautiful for the whole rest of your life. And when I think of that trip with them, think of meals we had together, but especially think about the beauty of what we saw there. It's just as alive as it was then. And now if we now think about, where did the thoughts come from in my past 10 minutes? How did that sequence of thoughts arise? And if you look at these two drawings, well, you can see the fractal essence, the underlying living pattern of how the thoughts come to us. It comes to us because each is connected to something else. And that thought that's in our mind then kind of pulls on a line of a thought that's related, perhaps 5 thoughts, and we have to pick one. And often that's what's happening when I'm kind of looking to the side. I'm trying to pick one of those strings to pull on, to pull up that part above the surface of the water and look at that and talk about that and touch it again. I hope that it is becoming obvious how important relationships are to me and people. And this coming from a man who didn't understand relationships for a good half of my life. In that first video I talked about that I am on the autism spectrum. And yet, if you're watching this video, you probably go, nah, nobody diagnosed him with that. He doesn't look like that kind of person. And right now I don't, because I'm talking the language of the majority world. Were you to see me talk to somebody who was my own kind, you would go, oh God, an R2-D2. Look at the two of them. My dear friend Maria, I have a very fond memory of when I was supervising her in her last year of her master's, and she was reading, at my suggestion, something from William James, and she could not get past the first couple sentences. And I remember us sitting down in a restaurant, and she's pulling out the book and showing me this, and she's saying, I can't make sense of this at all. And I looked at it, and William James is definitely, based on his use of words, language, on the autism spectrum, a brilliantly clear man. Even now, more than 100 years later, if you read him, although a few of the words are odd because they're from his time, they are just as true today, and they make you think. But they're so dense that you must go slow or you miss the point. So I have this moment of thinking about Maria in that restaurant, reading the opening paragraph of this book, and her being a perfectly normal majority personality human being and not being able to make any sense of it whatsoever, and me seeing as beautiful. And I think that she took away from that an interest in this other world, this other way of having thoughts, this other, a beauty that's there right in front of most people, and yet it's invisible. I can say now, some years later, she's come to love that way of thinking, even though it's a second language for her. In part, this has great meaning because she has a family member she's close to, a younger brother, who was like me. And my hope is that this has helped her to become closer, the two of them. And in some sense, this is the same thing I'm talking about, yet again, about the drawing. That what is the true motive of science? To discover the way natural things connect. Why? Because that is the way that we see meaning, beauty, love, life, everything It all comes from those connections. And the second of those drawings on this page, where it says the topography of the blocked conscious mind, block was the way that I began to remove the brokenness from the word wound. And you'll learn about this eventually, the non-judgmental way to look at an inability to see something. And that's really the root of wounds. It's the source of symptoms, etc. There's a lot to talk about. But this has been enough for this particular clip. I hope that you can take a little time to look at those two drawings and to try and let your body sense what it would be like to watch that physically happen. To see each of those little bubbles as different kinds of thoughts, and each of those bubbles twisting and turning and eventually almost magnetically being drawn to the surface as a collection that becomes one point, one ball, one experience. Hopefully some of them good. And hopefully some of them generated by your studies of emergence. Again, I'm happy that you're here.